How does someone forgive the people who enslaved them and then dedicate their life to saving their souls? What kind of love can turn a victim into a missionary, a slave into a liberator? And why did the boy who lost everything in Ireland return to give them the greatest gift of all? The gospel of Jesus Christ. Where does freedom end and calling begin? This is the story of St. Patrick, the slave who converted an entire nation. If you've ever wondered whether your worst experiences can become your greatest calling, this story will show you that God's grace can transform even the most painful chapters of our lives into instruments of His love. Hit like and subscribe for more carefully researched storytelling that turns contested legends into clear human history. Along the western coast of Roman Britain, a boy named Patricius was born around 390 AD into a world of privilege and comfortable Christianity. His grandfather had been a priest, his father Calpurnius was a deacon and local magistrate, and their villa overlooked fertile lands that had been in the family for generations. Young Patrick grew up taking it all for granted. The faith that meant so much to his family seemed like mere social convention, something respectable families practiced, but nothing that touched deeper currents of life. He attended church, memorized prayers, and went through the motions of devotion without real conviction. His education was typical for his class: Latin literature, rhetoric, theology, and practical skills for estate management. Patrick was intelligent but not brilliant, well-behaved but not particularly pious, destined for a comfortable life in provincial administration. The villa was a small world of safety and predictability. Servants tended his needs, tutors guided his studies, and the walls seemed strong enough to keep out any dangers. But beyond those walls, Irish raiders had been striking the British coast with increasing frequency, carrying off captives for Ireland's slave markets. Patrick knew about these raids in the abstract way. Privileged people know distant troubles, things that happen to others, never to someone like him. On a day that began like any other, when Patrick was 16, everything changed. Irish raiders struck his estate with military efficiency, overwhelming the guards and selecting the most valuable captives for transport. Patrick found himself torn from everything he had known: family, home, identity, future, and loaded onto a ship bound for a country he had never seen, to serve people he had been taught to fear. The comfortable world of his childhood was gone forever. But in that loss, something else was about to be born. The Ireland that Patrick saw from the deck of the slave ship was nothing like the civilized Roman world he had known. This was a land of mist and mystery, where Celtic warriors still painted themselves for battle and druids wielded power that seemed to blur the line between religion and magic. The green hills that rose from the coastline were beautiful but alien, promising not the comfort of home but the hardship of servitude. Patrick was sold to a chieftain named Milchu, who put him to work tending sheep on the slopes of Slemish Mountain in what is now County Antrim. The work was brutally simple: watch the flock, protect them from wolves, keep them from wandering too far, and survive the Irish weather with minimal shelter and inadequate clothing. For a boy who had never done physical labor, who had never been cold or hungry or truly alone, the shock was overwhelming. Patrick found himself spending entire days without human conversation, speaking only to the sheep whose wool-covered backs were his sole companions in a landscape that stretched endlessly in every direction. The first months were a nightmare of physical and emotional suffering. Patrick's hands, soft from his privileged upbringing, cracked and bled from handling rough sheep and exposure to constant moisture. His body, accustomed to regular meals and warm beds, struggled to adapt to sporadic food and sleeping rough in the open air. But worse than the physical hardship was the psychological torment. Patrick was utterly alone, cut off from everything that had given his life meaning and structure. He didn't speak the Irish language fluently enough to communicate with other slaves. He had no idea whether his family was alive or dead, whether anyone was looking for him, or whether he would ever see civilization again. What would you do if everything familiar was stripped away and you were left alone with nothing but your thoughts? It was in this extremity that Patrick made a discovery that would change not just his own life, but the history of an entire nation. With nothing else to turn to, he began to pray. Not the formal, ritualistic prayers of his childhood, but desperate, heartfelt cries for help that came from the deepest places of his soul. "The love of God and his fear grew in me more and more," Patrick would later write. "And the faith grew, and the spirit was stirred, so that, in a single day, I have said as many as 100 prayers, and in the night, nearly the same." The mountain that had seemed like a place of exile became a place of encounter with the living God. In the silence and solitude, Patrick began to hear the voice of God speaking to his heart with a clarity he had never experienced in the comfortable pews of his childhood church. His conversion was not dramatic in any external sense. There were no visions, no miraculous interventions, no sudden changes in his circumstances. But internally, everything was transformed. The bored, nominal Christian became a passionate believer. The privileged boy who had taken God for granted became a young man who found in prayer the strength to endure any hardship. After 6 years of slavery, Patrick experienced a dream that would change his life. He heard a voice telling him that his ship was ready, that the time had come for him to escape and return home. Following this divine guidance, Patrick left his master's service and walked across Ireland to find passage back to Britain. The slave was about to become free. But Ireland had not finished with him yet. Patrick's escape from Ireland should have been the end of his connection to the land that had enslaved him. After walking nearly 200 miles to reach the coast, he convinced a ship captain to give him passage back to Britain. The journey home was arduous. The ship was blown off course, and Patrick and his companions were forced to walk through desolate country for weeks before reaching civilization. But when Patrick finally arrived at his family's villa, the reunion was bittersweet. His parents had given him up for dead years before. The boy who had been taken away was now a man, hardened by suffering but also transformed by faith in ways that his family struggled to understand. Patrick tried to settle back into the comfortable life he had once known. His family welcomed him warmly and expected him to resume his place in Romano-British society, perhaps to marry, manage the family estates, and eventually take his father's position in local government. But Patrick had been changed too deeply to simply return to his old life. The years of slavery had given him a perspective on suffering that his comfortable relatives couldn't share. The experience of encountering God in desperate prayer had created a spiritual intensity that didn't fit easily into the formal Christianity of his social class. Most importantly, Patrick found himself thinking constantly about the Irish people he had left behind. These were the same people who had enslaved him, who had torn him from his family and subjected him to years of hardship. By every human standard, he should have hated them, feared them, or at least been content to forget them entirely. Instead, Patrick felt an unexpected compassion for their spiritual condition. He had learned enough Irish during his captivity to understand their religious beliefs, and he was haunted by the knowledge that an entire nation lived in spiritual darkness, worshiping gods of wood and stone, following druids who practiced human sacrifice, and dying without ever hearing the name of Jesus Christ. The inner conflict this created was intense. Patrick wanted to honor his parents' wishes and live peacefully in the safety of Roman Britain. But he couldn't escape the feeling that God was calling him to something far more dangerous and difficult. The resolution came in another dream, one so vivid and compelling that Patrick could never forget it. He saw a man coming from Ireland with countless letters, and he heard the voice of the Irish calling to him, "We beseech you, holy youth, come and walk among us once more." The message was unmistakable. God was calling Patrick to return to Ireland, not as a slave but as a missionary, not as a victim but as a bearer of the gospel that could transform the very people who had once oppressed him. Have you ever felt called to forgive those who hurt you, and then to serve them? Patrick's family was horrified. They had just gotten their son back from what they considered a barbarous country, and now he wanted to return voluntarily? His friends thought he had lost his mind. His relatives accused him of throwing away everything his grandfather and father had worked to build. But Patrick knew with absolute certainty that this calling came from God. He began preparing for ordination as a priest and missionary, studying scripture and theology with an intensity born of personal conviction rather than mere academic interest. The slave who had found freedom was about to return to his place of captivity as the bearer of ultimate liberation. In 432 AD, Patrick returned to Ireland as a bishop and missionary, landing on the same shores where he had once arrived in chains. But this time he came by choice, armed not with weapons but with the gospel, ready to offer spiritual freedom to the people who had once enslaved his body. The Ireland Patrick encountered was a complex tapestry of tribal kingdoms, each ruled by a local king and defended by warriors who valued courage above all. At the apex stood the High King at Tara and the Druids, whose religious knowledge made them the intellectual elite of Celtic culture. Patrick's strategy was brilliant and bold. Instead of starting with the powerless, he went directly to sources of authority. If he could convert kings and druids, entire tribes would follow. His first major confrontation came at Tara, where High King Lawhair was celebrating the pagan festival of Beltane. By Irish law, no fire could be lit until the king's fire was kindled at Tara. But Patrick deliberately lit the Easter fire on the Hill of Slane, visible from Tara, as a symbol that Christ's light was greater than any earthly authority. What would you do if standing for your faith meant defying kings and priests? The Druids were furious and convinced the king that this foreign priest threatened Irish tradition and royal authority. They demanded Patrick's execution as a revolutionary, but when brought before the High King, something extraordinary happened. Instead of a frightened missionary, Lawhair found a man who spoke Irish fluently, understood Celtic culture intimately, and could debate the Druids while demonstrating spiritual power they couldn't match. Patrick's years as a slave had given him insights no foreign missionary could gain. He knew how Celtic warriors thought, what motivated Irish farmers, how clan relationships shaped daily life. He could present Christianity not as alien Roman religion, but as fulfillment of Celtic spiritual longings. The confrontation ended not with Patrick's execution, but with grudging acceptance as a legitimate teacher. The king granted Patrick permission to preach throughout Ireland, authorization that carried enormous weight in Celtic society. The king let him live, but could Patrick truly conquer the soul of Ireland? Patrick's confrontation with the Druids at Tara was only the beginning of a spiritual war that would rage across Ireland for decades. The Druids represented more than just an alternative religion. They were the intellectual and spiritual foundation of Celtic civilization, the keepers of law, history, and the sacred traditions that had shaped Irish culture for centuries. These were not simple pagan priests, but sophisticated philosophers and practitioners of what they claimed was genuine supernatural power. They could predict the future, control the weather, and invoke curses that struck terror into the hearts of kings and warriors. Their opposition to Patrick was not just theological but existential. They recognized that Christianity threatened their entire worldview and social position. The battles that followed were unlike anything in missionary history. Patrick found himself in direct confrontation with Druids who challenged him to contests of spiritual power, testing whether the God of the Christians was stronger than the ancient gods of Ireland. The stories that emerged from these encounters became the stuff of legend. Patrick allegedly drove all the snakes from Ireland, a symbolic representation of his victory over the serpentine wisdom of Druidism. He used the three-leaf shamrock to explain the Trinity to pagan audiences who understood the sacred significance of triadic symbolism in their own tradition. But behind the legends lay a profound theological strategy. Patrick understood that the Irish people were already deeply spiritual. They believed in the supernatural, respected divine power, and sought meaning beyond the material world. His task was not to make them religious, but to redirect their religiosity toward the true God. His approach was revolutionary in its cultural sensitivity. Instead of condemning all Celtic traditions as demonic, Patrick identified elements that could be transformed rather than destroyed. Celtic festivals became Christian feasts. Sacred wells became baptismal sites. Ancient symbols were reinterpreted to carry Christian meaning. Can you imagine the courage it took to challenge an entire culture's understanding of the divine? The transformation of Ireland happened not through mass conversions, but through the patient work of changing hearts and minds one person at a time. Patrick established monasteries and schools where Irish monks could be trained to carry on the work of evangelization. He ordained Irish priests who could minister to their own people in their own language. But perhaps most importantly, Patrick demonstrated through his own life that Christianity could produce the kind of heroic virtue that Celtic culture admired. The former slave showed courage that impressed warriors, wisdom that convinced scholars, and compassion that touched the hearts of people who had never seen such love in action. The Ireland that emerged from Patrick's ministry was unlike anywhere else in the Christian world. It was a land where Celtic imagination and Christian truth merged to create a unique culture that would eventually send its own missionaries to reconvert the European continent after the barbarian invasions. The slave who had returned to forgive his captors had given them something far greater than freedom. He had given them eternal life. By the time of Patrick's death around 461 AD, Ireland had become known throughout Europe as the Island of Saints and Scholars. The pagan tribes that had once practiced human sacrifice were now sending missionaries to Scotland, England, and continental Europe. The transformation was so complete, it seemed miraculous. In less than 30 years, Patrick had accomplished what Roman legions had never attempted: complete conversion of an entire nation without military force. Patrick's success stemmed from his unique combination of spiritual authority and cultural understanding. He had suffered with the Irish people, learned their language perfectly, and understood their deepest hopes and fears. The monasteries he established became centers of learning that influenced all of Europe. Irish monks later traveled throughout the continent, carrying both the gospel and the classical learning they had preserved. What legacy will you leave when your time is over? But Patrick's greatest legacy was spiritual. He demonstrated that the gospel could transform any culture, no matter how resistant. The slave who forgave his captors showed that Christian love could overcome any barrier of race, culture, or historical grievance. The Ireland Patrick left behind was a Christian nation that would remain faithful to the gospel for over a millennium, surviving Viking invasions, Norman conquest, and English persecution. The faith he planted took such deep root that it became inseparable from Irish identity itself. How does a former slave become the spiritual father of an entire nation? The answer lay in Patrick's understanding that true authority comes not from position or power, but from service and sacrifice. He had earned the right to be heard by the Irish people not through conquering them, but through suffering with them. St. Patrick's death around 461 AD marked not the end, but the beginning of his true influence. The man who had returned to Ireland as a missionary became the symbol of Irish Christianity itself, the patron saint whose legacy would shape the Irish people's understanding of their identity and destiny for centuries to come. The Ireland Patrick left behind was unrecognizable from the pagan land he had evangelized. Monasteries dotted the landscape like lights in the darkness, preserving not only Christian teaching but also the classical learning that was being lost elsewhere in Europe as barbarian invasions destroyed Roman civilization. Irish monks trained in Patrick's tradition would become the missionaries who re-evangelized Scotland, northern England, and much of continental Europe. Saints like Columba, Aidan, and Columbanus carried the Irish synthesis of Celtic culture and Christian faith to lands that had lost touch with the gospel during the chaos of the post-Roman world. But Patrick's most profound legacy was the demonstration that no one is beyond redemption, no culture too alien for transformation, and no suffering too great to become a source of blessing for others. The teenage slave who had been torn from his comfortable life in Roman Britain had become the instrument through which God transformed an entire civilization. The story resonated so deeply with the Irish people because it mirrored their own experience of suffering and transformation. A people who had known slavery, invasion, and persecution found in Patrick a symbol of how God could bring good out of evil, hope out of despair, and blessing out of suffering. When waves of later missionaries from other countries attempted to impose foreign forms of Christianity on Ireland, they found a people who already possessed a vibrant Christian culture that was thoroughly Irish in its expression. Patrick's approach of transformation rather than replacement had created something new under the sun, a Christian civilization that was authentically Celtic. The annual celebration of St. Patrick's Day became more than just a religious feast. It became a celebration of Irish identity itself, a reminder that the Irish people had a special calling to be witnesses to the gospel throughout the world. Even when political persecution forced millions of Irish people to emigrate to other continents, they carried with them the faith that Patrick had planted and the conviction that their suffering could become a blessing for others, just as his had been for them. Today, St. Patrick is venerated not only in Ireland, but wherever Irish communities have settled around the world. His story continues to inspire anyone who has experienced slavery, whether physical, emotional, or spiritual, to believe that God can transform their worst experiences into their greatest opportunities for service. Patrick's life remains a testament to the power of grace to transform any heart, any culture, and any situation. He shows us that our past pain can become our future purpose, that our deepest wounds can become our greatest strengths, and that God's love can reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. From the mountains of Antrim to the halls of Tara, from the shores of Ireland to the ends of the earth, Patrick's legacy continues to proclaim that no one is too lost to be found, no one too enslaved to be freed, and no one too broken to be made whole. He went to Ireland in chains and returned with the key of faith that unlocked a nation